An undercover immigration officer was driving an unmarked vehicle when he pulled alongside a red Camaro on the highway. He noticed there were 4 men inside who were all Hispanic. And the 2 men in the rear never looked back at him. He believed that the 2 men did not look at him because they were nervous. But we might suspect that's because none of the men inside the vehicle believed that he was law enforcement. After all, the officer was driving an unmarked vehicle. The officer also later testified that the men, and I quote, kind of looked dirty, and it also looked like they recently slept and did not comb their hair. Because of that, the officer made a decision to pull over the vehicle on suspicion that the individuals inside were illegal aliens. Now, the driver later claimed that his Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable searches and seizures were violated. He said that the officer never had reasonable suspicion to pull over the vehicle. So today we're going to look at the case and try to determine what is needed before immigration officers can pull over a vehicle on the highway. If you're new to the Lost Stash channel, welcome, hit that subscribe button. If you're a returning viewer, you already know my name is Anton Vieltsin. I'm a criminal defense attorney here in the Southern District of California in San Diego. Because I work in the border district, a vast majority of my cases somehow relate to the border, either narcotics that go through the border or immigration-related offenses. So today we're going to discuss 8 U.S.C. Section 1324, transportation of illegal aliens, a charge that we commonly see in this district. So if you're charged with 1324 here in San Diego, feel free to give me a call because these are the type of cases I handle every day. So once again, welcome to Lost Stash channel. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. If you're listening to the podcast version of this recording on Audible or Spotify, please give my podcast a 5-star review rating. And finally, if you want to support this channel, consider going to loststash.com and check out some of the merch, including the Do Not Arrest This Person t-shirts. Thanks for watching.
Quick message from Lost Stash. Are you charged with a crime? Or do you want to know your rights if stopped by police? Watch California attorney Anton Vieltsin discuss legal cases from the Supreme Court, Ninth Circuit, and California state courts on the Lost Stash YouTube page. Anton has handled hundreds of federal and state criminal cases, has an in-depth knowledge of the law, and has the best mustache ever. Subscribe to the Lost Stash YouTube page. That's LAWSTACHE.
Today we're discussing a federal case, United States versus Ortega-Serrano. Now, from the introduction, you already know some of the facts of the case, but let's fill in the gaps. We know that immigration officer was patrolling I-35 in Texas when he saw a bright red Camaro drive by him. Inside, he thought he saw about 4 or 5 men. He radioed ahead to another officer that was positioned up the highway. Now, the second officer used binoculars. He saw the red Camaro approach, and inside, through the binoculars, he saw 4 Hispanic males. Now, for whatever reason, the officer thought that was suspicious. As the vehicle passed by, it was driving alongside some other vehicles, going about 70 miles an hour, so nothing suspicious there. The officer jumped in his patrol vehicle, but remember, this was an unmarked vehicle, and the immigration officer was undercover. He then proceeded to drive about 100 miles an hour, trying to catch up to the group of vehicles, including the Camaro. A few miles up the highway, he catches up to the group of vehicles, but the Camaro is already gone. So then the officer begins to drive even faster, trying to catch up to the Camaro. And he finally does about 10 to 12 miles up the highway. When the officer gets to the Camaro, he pulls along next to it, and he notices that the 2 men in the rear never look at him. The officer believes that's because the 2 men are nervous. But again, we know that the officer is driving an undercover vehicle, so it is perhaps that all the passengers inside do not even know that this is law enforcement. And I'm not sure Why? He was expecting for everybody to look at him. Maybe it's because he was driving 100 miles an hour, catching up to this vehicle. But anyways, he then also later testifies that the two men in the rear looked, and I quote, kinda dirty. He also said that the men looked like they were recently sleeping and did not comb their hair. Because of these facts, the officer made a decision to pull over the vehicle on suspicion that the individuals inside were illegal aliens. He turns on his undercover lights and the sirens, and Mr. Serrano immediately pulls over. The driver, Mr. Serrano, then eventually admits that he's illegally in the country. He does not have any papers, he's not a citizen of the United States, and because the other passengers are also illegally in the country, Mr. Serrano is charged with 8 U.S.C. 1324, transportation of illegal aliens. Now, Mr. Serrano later tries to suppress all the evidence found against him, namely the statements that he made about his citizenship, as well as the statements made by other passengers. He says that his Fourth Amendment rights were violated because the officer never had reasonable suspicion to pull him over in the first place. But let's take a look at the Fourth Amendment and see what the Supreme Court said in terms of the factors that are needed before immigration officers can pull somebody over on the highway. The Supreme Court held that the Fourth Amendment prohibits INS roving patrols from stopping vehicles in areas near but not at the Mexican border or its functional equivalent, and from questioning a vehicle's occupants as to citizenship absent a reasonable suspicion that the vehicle contains illegal aliens. Such a reasonable suspicion must be supported by specific articulable facts together with rational inferences from those facts that reasonably warrant suspicion that the vehicle contains illegal aliens. Factors that may properly be considered include, number 1, characteristics of the area where the vehicle is encountered, such as proximity to the border, unusual traffic patterns, and previous experience with alien traffic. Number 2, information about recent illegal border crossings. Number 3, erratic or evasive driving. Number 4, characteristics of the vehicle itself, whether it is among those type frequently used to transport aliens, whether it appears heavily loaded or has an unusually large number of passengers, or its passengers are observed trying to hide. And finally, number 5, although not sufficient standing alone, the apparent Mexican ancestry of the occupants. Now that we know the factors outlined by the Supreme Court, let's take a look at what we have here. The Camaro was pulled over about 300-400 miles north of the border, which is significant. We're nowhere close to the border, and there was no testimony by the officers that the vehicle came from the border. Now, there was also no testimony that the area where the vehicle was pulled over was somehow significant to alien smuggling. There was no testimony that more illegal aliens travel on that particular highway, or at least that section of the highway. We also know that Mr. Serrano never tried to evade the police. He pulled over as soon as the officer turned on the sirens and the lights. And finally, in terms of the vehicle itself, there was some testimony that the vehicle had a pretty bad paint job. One of the officers testified that just about everything was painted red other than the tires. But there was no testimony on how that's significant to alien smuggling. The Camaro was not modified to transport more illegal aliens, and we know that the 4 passengers inside were just about the right number of people for this vehicle. So at the end of the day, there was no reasonable suspicion. And here's how the court concludes. The court says, we have little doubt that Agent Hankin, an 18-year veteran, knew what he was doing when he stopped Serrano. The record, however, does next to nothing to convey the facts he relied on and the inferences he made on the basis of those facts. Now, I agree with the court. Like I said, there was no reasonable suspicion to pull over this vehicle. But I will disagree in the fact that the agent knew what he was doing. Instead, I will say that we should not be applauding officers on working on a hunch when pulling over vehicles. A hunch is specifically prohibited by the Supreme Court when it comes to reasonable suspicion. So now you understand the factors that the Supreme Court outlined. These factors we've been using for years. And so officers do need to have reasonable suspicion to pull over vehicles that they suspect have illegal aliens. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something about 8 U.S.C. Section 1324, transportation of illegal aliens. And if you did, give this video a thumbs up. If you're new to the Lost Tash channel, please hit that subscribe button. If you're a returning viewer, or if you're listening to the podcast version of this recording on Audible or Spotify, please give my podcast a 5-star rating. And finally, if you want to support this channel, consider going to loststash.com and check out some of the merch, including the Do Not Arrest This Person t-shirts. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next Wednesday for another deep dive on another criminal case. Thanks for watching.